What if the world you think you know? What if your deepest beliefs weren't entirely your own?
That's a pretty unsettling thought to start with.
It is, right. But imagine if opinions could be, well, engineered, quickly, effectively.
Like the example of Woodrow Wilson.
Exactly. Elected in 1916, promising peace, peace without victory, that was the slogan.
Yeah.
And then, just 6 months later, the U.S. is plunged into World War I. The Creel Commission he set up.
Ah, yes, the Committee on Public Information.
They turned a population that was largely pacifist into a warmongering frenzy, wanting to destroy everything German.
In just 6 months, that speed is
That's
quite something. It really highlights what the sources call propaganda's power.
And it wasn't just about the war, was it?
No, not at all. They used the very same techniques right after the war to whip up the Red Scare.
Which had real consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Damaging unions, freedom of the press, freedom of thought, and the media and business leaders were apparently right there supporting it.
What's maybe most surprising is who was involved in the war propaganda effort.
You mean the progressive intellectuals?
Yeah, the John Dewey Circle, people you might not expect. The sources say they took pride in it.
Pride in driving a reluctant population toward war through
fear, patriotism, even outright fabrications. Stories of atrocities by the Huns, Belgian babies with their hands cut off. Things like that.
And the British were doing similar things, trying to influence American opinion.
Right. Their propaganda ministry aimed to, and I quote, direct the thought of most of the world, especially targeting influential Americans.
So the lesson learned, unfortunately, was that state propaganda works, especially if the educated classes are on board and there's no real dissent allowed.
A lesson Hitler apparently picked up on later.
Which brings us to thinkers who were observing this, like Walter Lippmann.
A major figure in journalism and political theory back then. He saw these propaganda successes.
And was impressed by them.
Deeply impressed. He saw it as a kind of revolution in the art of democracy. His idea was about needing to manufacture consent.
Manufacture consent. Why did he think that was necessary?
Well, his view was that common interests elude public opinion. Basically, the big issues are too complex for ordinary people.
So who should manage things, according to Lippmann?
A specialized class. These are the responsible men who can understand and make the decisions.
That sounds quite elitist, almost like a vanguard party idea in a different context.
It does have that echo, doesn't it? He essentially divided citizens into two groups.
This specialized class.
Right. They do the thinking, the analyzing, the deciding, and then there's everyone else.
The bewildered herd, as he famously called them.
Yes, the majority. Their role. Mostly just be spectators. Maybe vote occasionally to lend weight to one of the responsible men.
So the underlying logic is what? That most people are just not smart enough.
Pretty much. Too stupid is the blunt assessment in the source material describing this view. So the herd needs to be tamed, guided.
Through this manufacture of consent, using media.
Media, schools, popular culture, all playing a role. They provide a sort of acceptable reality for the decision makers while distracting the rest of us.
Keeping the herd occupied and out of the way.
Essentially, yeah. It's about managing democracy, not necessarily enabling it in the participatory sense.
And others shared this kind of view.
Oh, yes. Thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr talked about necessary illusions. Basically, simplified stories needed to guide the, naive public.
Necessary illusions.
And Harold Lasswell argued against what he called democratic dogmatisms, this idea that people are always the best judges of their own interests. He felt propaganda was more fitting for democracies than, say, brute force.
So persuade rather than coerce, but still control.
Exactly, which naturally leads to the rise of a whole industry dedicated to this.
Public relations?
The U.S. was really the pioneer there, wasn't it? With a clear commitment, as the sources put it, to control the public mind.
Learning directly from the Creel Commission and the Red Scare experiences.
And they got very good at it. In the 1920s, the PR industry was seen as highly successful in getting the public to accept business dominance.
So successful, it led to congressional investigations in the 30s.
Right, because things started to shift then. The Depression hit hard.
And labor started organizing more effectively.
Huge strikes, pushes for workers' rights, culminating in the Wagner Act in 1935.
Which guaranteed the right to organize.
Which, from the perspective of the business establishment and these theorists, was a problem. A democratic deviation, they called it.
A deviation from their preferred order? So they fought back.
With PR, absolutely. The 1937 steel strike is a key example mentioned. They developed something called the Mohawk Valley formula.
Sounds scientific.
It was presented that way, a scientific method of strike breaking, but it was pure propaganda.
How did it work?
By framing the conflict in specific ways, painting the strikers as disruptive, un-American troublemakers,
I'm the company.
as representing harmony, order, Americanism, turning the community against the strikers. It was very sophisticated.
Using positive-sounding words to undermine legitimate grievances.
It reminds you of those vacuous slogans we still hear, doesn't it? Like, support our troops.
Right. Who's going to say they don't support the troops?
Exactly. But it completely distracts from asking why the troops are deployed or what the policy actually is. It shuts down debate.
By appealing to emotion and conformity.
And that fits the PR model of democracy. A specialized class serving the owners of society, while the rest are kept isolated, distracted.
Distracted by consumer goods, entertainment, empty values.
Kept from organizing or thinking too critically about how things are run.
This need to manage opinion becomes especially clear when it comes to foreign policy, doesn't it?
Very clear. The sources argue the public is generally pacifist. People don't usually want war.
So if you want to have a foreign adventure, you need to.
You need to whip up the population, create that frenzy we talked about earlier.
And Edward Bernays comes into play here, too.
He does. Nephew of Freud, also part of that Creel Commission group. He really developed the concept of engineering of consent.
Engineering consent. He saw that as democratic.
He literally called it the very essence of democracy. But crucially, he saw himself as serving the interests of the business community.
And put it into practice.
Oh, incisely. The example given is his PR campaign for the United Fruit Company in 1954.
To overthrow the government of Guatemala.
The democratically elected government, yes. Bernays helped create the public climate in the U.S. that allowed the CIA-backed coup to happen, painted the government as a communist threat.
It shows how powerful this engineering can be, shaping perceptions to justify actions.
And it's not just foreign wars. The sources argue extensive propaganda is also needed to push through unpopular domestic programs.
Like with Reagan. Despite his landslide win.
Polls apparently showed most people disagreed with many of his specific policies on things like social spending or intervention in Central America. The landslide didn't necessarily mean agreement on issues.
Which highlights a gap between the image presented and maybe the public's actual feelings.
And if you're someone who does disagree, but you don't see your views reflected in the media, you don't hear others saying it.
You feel isolated. You think you're the only one.
Which makes it harder to challenge things. And This is where, critical thinking becomes so important. And incidentally, resources like Mindful Moments and our podcasts, which is an AI audiobook analysis channel on YouTube, delve into these kinds of media dynamics.
Encouraging people to question the narratives they're given.
Precisely. Because often, to keep consent manufactured, you need enemies.
The parade of enemies strategy.
Exactly. Construct these major monsters. The Russians during the Cold War, international terrorists, narco-traffickers, Saddam Hussein.
Always some big threat looming.
And it's a recurring pattern, isn't it? Seems like every year or two there's a new focus to rally people against and divert attention.
Divert attention from problems at home, perhaps.
That's the argument made. And the media plays a crucial role in how these enemies and their victims are portrayed. Selectively.
You mean like the case of Armando Valladares?
Yeah, the Cuban prisoner. His accounts of torture got huge media attention in the West. Front page news, books.
And contrasted with,
say, human rights workers being tortured and murdered in El Salvador around the same time by forces the U.S. was backing.
People like Herbert Anaya.
Their stories, even with sworn testimony, video evidence, largely ignored by the mainstream press.
So attention depends on who is doing the torturing and who the victim is, relative to political interests.
It appears that way. There was a study mentioned from the University of Massachusetts about attitudes towards intervention.
What did it find?
It found people generally supported intervention against things like illegal occupation or massive human rights abuses. Strong majority support.
Okay, that seems reasonable.
But when asked about specific cases where the U.S. was involved or backing the side doing those things, like Israel's occupation of Lebanon or Indonesia's invasion of East Timor,
the support vanished.
Pretty much. The principle wasn't applied consistently, suggesting perceptions were shaped by factors other than just the stated principles.
Which brings us to a more recent example used in the sources. The first Gulf War.
Right. A major case study in how this all supposedly works.
One key point made is the near total exclusion of the Iraqi democratic opposition from Western media.
People who hated Saddam Hussein, but also opposed the U.S.-led war and the sanctions, their views aligned closely with the peace movement here.
But they were effectively invisible.
Invisible. Meanwhile, the reasons given for war, reversing aggression, upholding international law,
Were principles the U.S. itself didn't always follow, according to the analysis, Panama, for instance, or support for South Africa's occupation of Namibia.
there's also the issue of diplomacy being sidelined.
You mean the potential for a negotiated settlement?
Yes. There was a Washington Post ABC poll showing strong public support for Iraq withdrawing from Kuwait if, in return, the UN Security Council considered the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Linking the issues, essentially. Diplomacy.
But the official line was no linkage, opposed diplomacy, and the poll results showing support for it, downplayed or ignored.
And weren't there actual Iraqi offers to withdraw?
Offers were made, yes. Released by U.S. officials themselves, apparently. Iraq offered to pull out of Kuwait in exchange for discussing the Arab-Israeli conflict and regional weapons of mass destruction.
Which raises the question, did sanctions even need more time if withdrawal was potentially on the table?
It certainly complicates the narrative that war was the absolute last resort.
Then there was the rhetoric around the conflict itself.
Oh, definitely. The focus on Scud missiles hitting Israel presented as this outrageous act.
Without much questioning of, say, U.S. or Israeli actions in the region that might provide context.
And the portrayal of Saddam Hussein himself.
As this monster about to conquer the world.
Right. Despite Iraq being objectively pretty weakened after the long, brutal war with Iran, a war where the U.S. and others had actually supported him.
It sounds similar to how Manuel Noriega was built up as a major threat just before the U.S. invasion of Panama.
There's a pattern noted, yeah. Demonize the leader, exaggerate the threat, ignore diplomatic options, control the narrative.
So the picture the public gets
Can end up having only a very remote connection to the actual reality. Layers of framing, omission, outright lies sometimes.
and the goal, ultimately, according to this analysis,
Is to deter the threat of democracy, meaning genuine public participation and control over their own affairs. Even when you have formal freedoms, this manufacturing of consent keeps the bewildered herd in line.
So wrapping this up, the core idea from these sources is that there's a consistent historical pattern.
A pattern of managing information, shaping opinion, often to serve specific interests, whether it was Wilson needing war support or justifying interventions later on.
Using techniques refined over decades, from the Creel Commission to modern PR and media strategies.
Which leaves us with a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? What kind of society do we actually want?
Do we want one where information is open, accessible, and people meaningfully participate?
Or one where control is maintained, maybe subtly through propaganda, distraction, the manufacturing of consent?
It makes you wonder, looking around today, what are the current meaningless slogans? Who are the designated enemies on parade right now?
How might those things be shaping our own perspectives, maybe without us fully realizing it?
That's the critical question to ask ourselves, I think.
Absolutely. And thinking critically is key. For more analyses exploring these kinds of topics, do subscribe to the channel.
And share this discussion if you found it valuable. Encourage others to think about these dynamics too.
If you want to delve deeper into the source material discussed, like media control, check out the link in the description to purchase the book. It helps support further analysis.
But most importantly, keep questioning. Keep thinking critically about the information you consume every day.